Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. As you can see, I have with me Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain, who's going to give us a point of view and what exactly is the Ukrainian military up to. We've spoken about the tactics of the war. We've spoken about lessons that India can learn. We've spoken about a whole lot of things which are being discussed. But a very little has been said about what are the tactics that are being used by the Ukrainian military. Just on a byline, something that Taiwan is watching very, very carefully, I might add. So, interesting subject, and I'm actually going to be, very, very interested to hear your military views about what they're doing on the ground and how they are able to keep the mighty Russian army at bay.
Jai Hind to all our viewers. And let me say how popular your Dev Talks is going. I'm getting a lot of feedback from people to say that this is the channel to really look at, because this is where you get unbiased views on, particularly from the field, in terms of what's happening on the ground. As to your question, we will discuss this in fair detail as we go along. But obviously, what is happening at the moment is that the Russians seem to have bitten off too much and are not being able to deliver in military terms, in military ways. Very broad front, they have advanced on a very broad front, north, east, portions of the southeast. Nowhere have they concentrated and focused on capture of real objectives. They seem to have plastered the cities, used a lot of missile power, lots of guns, bombing, all kinds of other means of delivering munitions, but they haven't put their boots on ground. And unless you put your boots on ground, you are not going to capture this, right? And the Ukrainians are obviously now what is emerging is that we underassessed the Ukrainian capability. And we perhaps didn't know enough of what was happening from 2014 till 2021, when this hybrid war was going on. What was happening as far as the Ukraine armed forces are concerned? They were training, they were being equipped by NATO, and obviously a lot of preparatory work was going on for an impending potential Russian invasion. And that's how you find a much better performance as far as the Ukrainian armed forces are concerned.
You hit the nail on the head, sir. We've underestimated their capability. And even the US in public statements has mentioned that Kiev will fall very fast. Somewhere down the line, that actually gave us all a surprise, and a pleasant one, I might add.
In fact, if we look at Kiev, yes, one of the, or should we start by saying the political objectives, no one has, of course, defined them, but we are all perceiving them. My perception of what the objectives, political military objectives, were essentially regime change, which meant the capture of the national capital, Kiev. The second thing was enhanced influence over the eastern region, that's Donbass. That's where the Russian majority resides. The degradation of the Ukrainian armed forces to prevent their future capability, and perhaps the capture of a few important cities to deliver home the message and establish a military dominance, a psychological dominance over the Ukrainian government and its forces. To my mind, none of these objectives have been achieved. And we will discuss this as we go along.
Absolutely, sir. Sir, you started with the political objectives of Russia. Let me put this across the other side of the line when I'm going to ask you, what were the political objectives set out for the armed forces of Ukraine by the leadership of Ukraine, sir?
You see, when a power which is on the defensive, first of all, Ukraine is the victim. It is the one which has absorbed the weight of the Russian invasion. The objectives of such a thing is very clear. Prevent the fall of the government, that is, prevent territory being captured, defend the cities as far as possible. In fact, many of these cities are virtually being defended as last man, last round kind of a strategy, right? And overall, I would say prevent a comprehensive victory to the Russian armed forces. That is really the military aim, and you said the political aim of the Ukrainians was essentially to make sure that the regime was intact, which is exactly the opposite of what the Russian aim was. Regime was intact. The regime would continue maintaining, the leadership would continue in place, and every effort of the Russians to capture maximum territory would be resisted. This was primarily the broad aims here.
Fantastic, sir. Sir, talking about the, adaptability of the Ukrainian army, I mean, you spoke about their operations from 2014. That just tells you they're pretty much battle hardened. They've been at war for a long time now. They also show a very clear capability of adapting to different weapon systems. For example, there's a whole bunch load of weapon systems coming in from NATO countries, and they're able to take them, use them within days of receiving them. How do you see this, sir?
See, the Ukrainians appear to have a very good technological orientation. This is a country which is very famous for its precision engineering, lots and lots of instruments and equipment of that kind. They have been providing a lot of technologies around the world. We have taken, I think, some technologies from the Ukraine also. The original T-72 tanks of India used to come from the Ukrainian factories when they used to come from the Soviet Union in the good days gone by. With all this, the Ukrainians are very fast learners, it seems. Lots and lots of sophisticated equipment has been flown in, brought in by road. And what I hear from our sources is that 2 to 3 day orientation on the ground is being done. Very basic rudimentary training being done on the handling of that equipment. And these detachments, which are equipped with these anti-tank weapons, the Stinger missiles, are immediately then sent out into the field. They are well networked together. They operate in a large number of them. It's almost like flocking together with a large swarm of, just like it happens with drones. You do swarming with drones, which is virtually swarming with anti-tank teams, anti-aircraft or anti-helicopter teams, which are swarming out into the field. As a result, what is happening is the Russians are very reluctant to close in with the built-up areas, because the moment the tanks start closing in into the built-up areas, you find the missile fire going berserk, absolutely. And the basic disadvantage the Russians face is that they are not using their teams in a combined manner, in which sense that the teams are tank and infantry teams with them, but the tanks are coming in and the infantry is not being utilized, not being deployed adequately. There is no flank protection being given by the infantry. There is very little air cover. Even when the tanks are moving on the roads or off the roads, there is no helicopter cover. So, when you have helicopters hovering in the area, you're fully aware from the air, you can make out where these anti-tank teams are generally, hiding, where are they camouflaged and deployed. It's basic helicopter reconnaissance which gives you all this. Then the scout helicopters go out and immediately start a surveillance of the area, etc. And then they call up the infantry teams, they call up the mortars to try and take out these teams. None of this is happening. So as a result, what is happening is the Ukrainians, with this equipment, which is very, very modern equipment, all of them, they are the Javelin missile, for example, Javelin anti-tank missile is a top attack missile, which means it attacks the top of the tank, the top of the armored vehicle, which is the weakest portion of the armored vehicle, right? So all this has been understood, and obviously with these technologies deployed against the Russians and the Russian equipment, there is a generational gap between what the Russians are fielding and what the Ukrainians are fielding in terms of equipment. And you very correctly pointed out, very quick learners, on the ball, absolutely, and highly motivated. Now, the more you succeed, the more you want to go out, your offensive spirit builds up. The Russians have suffered. They say the Russians have suffered as many as maybe 500 tanks, which they have lost. The overall assessment is that with the kind of fatal casualties and injured soldiers, the Russians may have been forced to take out about 30,000 of their troops out of the 150,000 troops that were deployed, which means one fifth of a force being taken out due to casualties means that that force is virtually paralyzed, which means the mind is not really working, and that offensive spirit is not there. They are still relying only on delivery of munitions, which does not deliver you results.
Firepower, sir, to a large
Yeah.
extent. So, I'm going to make an observation. When you talked about detachments, you're talking about smaller units of, soldiers, Ukrainians bunched out into the battlefield, not really drawing a frontage or a line, but doing standoff attacks onto the Russians, and videos of which that we've seen across. Now that the Russian tactics are changing and they're trying to, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, create a frontage towards the eastern part of Ukraine, to create a line of some sort where they can also concentrate their efforts. Looking at the casualties, I'm sure they're trying to, reduce the amount of war areas. How do you see the entire battle tactics of both these guys changing across on the field, sir?
That's a splendid question, because obviously we are hearing now that the so-called Russian drawdown, and they offered a drawdown. It appeared instead of a ceasefire, they were looking at a drawdown from the Kyiv area. It was obviously a part of the strategy. They were making no headway in Kyiv. They were not making any headway in the north in those areas, and therefore they were wanting to now redeploy to the east and concentrate on the east, because obviously the war aim seems now the capture, no longer the enhancement of influence, but perhaps the capture of the Donbass area, and possibly rest the forward line somewhere on the Dnieper River, which means obviously the cities on the other side of the Dnieper River will be the targets of the Russians. It will not be so easy to take them on unless they bring in combined teams, unless they bring in a concentration of forces. The mistake the Russians have made is that they've spread themselves thin. And they haven't done local concentration. When you got on an offensive, local concentrations are necessary at some point when you are meaning business to capture territory and capture, nodes as such, nodes of defenses as such, cities as such. This they have not done. They've refrained from doing it. They will probably be forced to do it, and they'll suffer more casualties. Now, that is the thing. That is where this ding-dong battle will go on. More the casualties, the greater the effect, psychological effect on the Russian soldiers, etc., and you may just find the offensive petering out. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, may not stick to fixed defenses. No, except the cities, a few villages, built up areas here and there, they will probably base their defenses on this. But largely, to my mind, they will use all these gaps to fill up with lots and lots of these detachments. There are, any number of missile launchers which are coming in from the west, all kinds of equipment, which is essentially anti-tank equipment, which is coming in from the west. When you create the screen of these missiles all over, it will become very difficult for the Russian armor to maneuver and get behind anywhere. This is where ultimately the decision will matter, because if the Ukrainians can hold on to that front line, can hold on to these positions, prevent the maneuver of this Russian armor, which to my mind they will be able to do, because the Russians have shown no propensity for any maneuver so far. They haven't gone and isolated the cities. They haven't tried to invest by pushing in these early warning elements and these anti-tank teams, etc. They've allowed themselves to become the prey of these teams. And the teams, obviously, their morale and their psyche has enhanced in a great way, very, very offensive in their outlook probably today. So I don't think the Donbass is either going to be a very simple affair. The only thing is that there are Russian-speaking people here, again, taking on ethnic Russians out here, taking on these cities with greater Russian presence and blasting them to smithereens is not something that the Russians can easily do either. So this is a touch and go. And therefore, I think if the Ukrainians can hold on, this may turn out to be a long war. Now, I mean, looking at the strategic sides of it, this may just turn out to be a longer war than we were imagining earlier. And to my mind, there is no victor, there's no vanquished in this kind of a situation. Because to say the Ukrainians have won is also not right? So it is a no victor, no vanquished kind of a situation. The one thing that the Russians will be looking for strategically is a face saver. How to capture one or two or three major cities and then perhaps declare a ceasefire, or capture maximum territory up to the Dnieper, some pockets of areas, etc., migrator areas within the Donbass area, establish your hold over there, and then try and negotiate a ceasefire. The Ukrainians may not agree to a ceasefire. For all you know, the Ukrainians may not. They may be sensing a military victory, although I would say that would not be very prudent on their part, because the Ukrainians are going to run out of steam very soon. They have their limitations. Lots and lots of their support capability has been taken out, as we were discussing earlier. Many of their factories have been destroyed. So reinforcements of things in the field is not going to be very easy, except for the equipment which is coming in from the West, right? And you can't depend on that pipeline forever.
Yeah. How long? Some point of time they're going to get, stopped, sort of the thing.
But having said that, Aadi, the surprising thing to my mind is that the Russians have left the western flank completely free, right? You find there isn't any no-fly zone there. Despite there being no-fly zone there, the Russians are not flying there. They're not attempting to do any surveillance, any reconnaissance, any domination of the routes which are coming in from the from the NATO countries. It is along these routes that all this equipment is coming into some of the smaller airports and airfields that this equipment is being flown in. So if actually they could have prevented it, but I suspect that the Russians do not have the means to do it. I suspect that the Russians do not want to overstretch themselves, because if they do that, as it is, they are stretched thin all along the ground. Looking at the West may stretch them even further.
They're not looking at complete domination as per se of the entire country, rather than the fact that of tactical areas that they're wanting to,
areas, correct, as we just discussed.
So we know that the Ukrainian army is getting a lot of intelligence from the West and from UK, from US, and God alone knows where all information is coming to them. Tells you two things. One, their processing of that intelligence. Two, the communication of that intelligence to these detachments and these small units of soldiers that are flying around the place. Of course, they're in their home territory, so they're getting logistics as far as basic food and all that is concerned would not be much of a challenge for them. But having said that, communicating to them tactical intelligence on the ground would be a challenge, and they seem to be, getting that right.
Well, it is the Russians who have come in, and they are the invaders. And obviously, they are now deployed on Ukrainian soil. Many of the smaller villages and towns, etc. The local Ukrainians are there. So the field intelligence is coming in probably from local sources. But as important as that is the amount of intelligence probably on deployments, etc., which is coming through satellite imagery. And you've got a plethora of these advanced countries who are now providing all this to the Ukrainians. I'm sure the hawk's eye, the US, UK, France, everyone is probably looking at the various areas. I'm sure if they must have done some kind of a business of dividing up the areas and having a look at each of them by different countries, by different organizations. Satellite coverage, once you got adequate satellite coverage, the battlefield becomes transparent absolutely to you. You know where exactly their movements are going to be. You can predict what the movements are going to be. So much of this is coming, and probably in a very timely way. It is being sent out to the Ukrainian headquarters. And yes, you're right. The communication is good. The processing is fast, and they are communicating it in near time almost to the front immediately for responses to take place. You see, it's good to get intelligence, it's good to get timely intelligence and have transparency, but if you don't respond to that intelligence, then it's no point. But here, we are seeing that the Ukrainians are responding uh, adequately to this, and that is one of the reasons why they are being able to stem potential Russian movements which are taking place around the cities in particular.
Some very interesting lessons from this entire conflict from the Ukrainian point of view. So everybody's been talking about, a lot of the generic battlefield, but if you look at it from the Ukrainian side, is something very interesting coming out. There, of course, a lot of help from the West, there's no question, which brings me to logistics. I mean, they're able to deliver these weapons coming in from Poland West and to frontline areas, Kiev, Donbass. And I mean, what surprises me is Mariupol, city which is pretty much surrounded, but there's still some stuff which is going inside there. That's why the resistance. How do you see the logistical setup of the Ukrainians, and how are they managing it even after so many days of war?
I think we had a discussion on this also once between you and me. And yes, you're right, absolutely 100%. The tendency around the world is to look at the romantic side of soldiering, and that is operations, right? The war front, small scale operations going on, detachments firing there, tactical, sub-tactical operations going on, where decorations are won by people, etc. No one looks at what is happening at the rear. At the rear, there's a tremendous amount of thing which is going on, work which is going on to ensure that the man who's fighting in the front does not have to look over his shoulder. He wants his missile, the missile is there, delivered to him, right? He got casualties, he doesn't have to look over his shoulders to get someone to come and evacuate the casualties. The casualties are evacuated, they're taken to the hospitals, they're looked after immediately, right? No, the Ukrainians are fighting on their own territory. That's the major advantage, right? Secondly, they are also fighting on what are called the interior lines, right? They're fighting on the interior lines. The Russians are on the exterior lines. When you're on the exterior lines, responding to anything takes you that much longer because distances are much more, right? Your logistics therefore become the major challenge. When you're on the interior lines here, switching flanks, switching units and subunits from one side to the other side, and the flow of logistics becomes that much more simpler. So, and then when you're fighting on your own territory, you can also live off the land. Because the classic example is, I remember in Punjab, in 1990-91, I was in Punjab, in this area of Bhikiwin, Taran and places like that, and we were fighting militancy at that time. I didn't have to take my breakfast with me when I was going for operations. The breakfast came to me from the villagers. They on their own, they came and they saw that there's an officer sitting there among them next to a well, and you found the best of stuff coming out from the Punjabi homes, from the Sikh homes, and coming to you, and you get the best of things to eat. So this is living off the land, right? It creates a lot of goodwill also. So when you find the Ukrainians are probably fighting in their own territory, there are lots of Ukrainians supporting all this on the ground itself. So operational logistics as such is played out in different dimensions. Besides just the maintenance of giving you food and water, it is also a lot to do with ammunition. Because without ammunition, the movement of ammunition is so important. Movement of spares, and then having repair facilities.
Yeah,
you see, a lot of equipment breaks down because equipment is really put to test here. It is, it is really ground into the whole system there. And as a result, a lot of equipment breaks down. Particularly, vehicles don't have a very long life. You see, so many moving parts in particular, so they have a tendency to break down. So you need repair echelons with you. Now, all these things have to be catered for. Obviously, on interior lines of communication, the Ukrainians have got their act together and are much, much better than the Russians. The Russians did not pay sufficient attention to operational logistics because they felt, because of overconfidence and hubris and whatever you want to say, they didn't cater for something probably more than 5 to 7 days of sustenance, and they didn't probably move stocks close enough to the border. Right? For this kind of an operation, you may assess you're going for 7 days of war fighting. For that, you need to at least stock up 14 to 20 days. That the reserves have not been catered for by the Russians, and that's a major mistake.
I think the world, as well as Russia, underestimated the Ukrainian army. And that is a very interesting bottom line that is going to come out, I think, from the entire war that will, whenever it does
Absolutely.
end. Some battlefield advantage. The Russians are moving in armor. And I read a couple of articles, I may be wrong here, but, visual obstructions which are created on the battlefield for the armor to move. I mean, you've written an article about it, about the factor of the wrong timing of the Russian armor advances because of the muddy roads and the spring thaw that was taking place. That combined with no visual obstructions are giving a clear battlefield advantage to the Ukrainians, and which they are taking advantage of. Tells you a couple of things about their capabilities.
General Winter, if you remember, Napoleon's army, General Winter is what defeated Napoleon. Chose the wrong time to carry out his operations. This is exactly what has happened here. Ukraine is again supposed to be a mud hole. The entire country, the countryside is just full of mud. And when the thaw comes in the month of February or so, February or March, when the thaw starts coming in, everything gets converted into marsh. And the one thing which tanks do not ever like, you ask any good tank commander, and he'll always tell you, keep me away from a boggy area. Well, the one thing which a tank commander never likes is to be bogged down by marsh or something which will not give traction to his tracks. After all, the tanks move with tracks. That traction is not there. He's going to get bogged down and he becomes a sitting duck. Actually becomes a sitting duck because you've got a gun which can just rotate around on a turret, but you can be taken on by different weapon systems from anywhere. So this is something which, in the timing of this entire operation, somehow, I don't know why the Russians went in at this time. Perhaps they were in a hurry to think that post-Afghanistan, the NATO morale is down, the psyche of NATO is more defensive at this particular time. They may not respond. Their leadership at this time is reasonably inexperienced. And I think it's because many of these contributing factors that the Russians thought that the month of February, March was the best time to go in, not realizing that the terrain was not in their favor at this particular time. And that's exactly what has happened. Otherwise, to my mind, I mean, my perception, I somehow can't get convinced that the Russian armor is not efficient enough and not capable enough. You ask some of our cavalry officers of the Indian Army who have trained with the Russians, who have trained with Russian equipment in Russia itself, they all sing praises for what they learned from the Russians at that time, the Russian doctrines that they learned from them. All this doesn't seem to have translated into action on the ground. Perhaps I would say, because the Russians have really not fought a conventional war. Even they fought in Chechnya, they fought in Georgia, they fought, some other areas here and there, which were generally low-intensity conflicts. Nothing conventional. No one was firing a missile. No one was defending a tank or taking a tank across in that manner of an offensive, formation put together. None of that. So as a result, the Russians have not fought like this for long. And they went into Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, when they went in 1979, end of 79, that too was really saying, once again, a sub-conventional conflict, right? And so the Russians have really not had that kind of experience at all. And probably that is what has affected their overall operational efficiency.
Tells us a lot, and Ukrainians seem to be taking advantage of that, and they're choosing the time of their attacks and choosing the places for their attack. I mean, they could have hit that, and a lot of people ask that question: why didn't they hit that 60-kilometer long convoy standing outside Kiev? But perhaps
the Ukrainian Air Force did not. This whole war has seen one thing: the absence of air power to a very great extent, right? It's been ground battles, and ground battles also more a battle of detachments than anything else, right? Small teams which have made a huge difference. But air power coming into its own, what we saw in Iraq, the type of shock and awe and things like that, that has not manifested here in any big way. And as you very correctly observed, that 64-kilometer long convoy of A vehicles, which was north of Kyiv, should have been blasted out by the Ukrainian Air Force. But possibly the Ukrainian Air Force was also had its limitations, or still has got its limitations.
So, propaganda. And that's where I think Ukrainians are winning with a lot of help from the West, of course, there's no question. But to create propaganda, you need content. That content is coming out from the ground by either soldiers, by battlefield journalists, or just general citizens. But there seems to be some structure which has been created to get this kind of, videos, and you see footage coming out of a war that you've not seen in terms of hits and stuff like that for a long time.
You see, Adi, the means, the instruments of information warfare are largely in the hands of NATO and the West.
True.
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, these are not things which are in the hands, under the control of the Russians, right? And the Russians may generate a tremendous amount of information, which they have been doing during the 2014 to 2021 period. They have been generating a lot of information, and information warfare did come into its own as far as the area of Donbass was concerned. But now, when the general war has been engaged in, and the West has joined in a big way like this, information warfare has been taken on by the West. The English language is making a difference. You see, you put out messages in English and half the world is reading it. In India, we are picking up all this through the social media, which is coming to us. We are picking up through CNN, through Al Jazeera, and all other kind of channels which are coming out. No one is putting this out in Russian. No one is, and the Russians, even if they try, cannot really, get people to put the Russian version on these various instruments to allow this to proliferate into the environment. So, by and large, the information warfare in an environment of this kind will always remain in favor of the West, which has all the controls on the instruments of social media, right? And they've done a very good job. Let me say they've done a very good job, because frankly saying, all my information is Western sources. I wish I did tweet today. I tweeted my own writings this morning, and I got some Russian response to say that there is a version of Russia also. I said, I wish that Russian version was available to me. I would love to see it. I would love to see a translation of it. But then they quietened down, because they also realized that it's not possible, and they are just not up to it. So you're absolutely right. In modern warfare today, psychological warfare, information warfare is making a huge difference. What about cyber? The Russians haven't really utilized cyber in any great way either. They haven't tried to paralyze the Ukrainian setup. Ukraine has got a fair amount of networks which have not been paralyzed in any great way by the Russians as such. So when you're looking at every dimension, you're looking at armor, you're looking at infantry, you're looking at operational logistics, you're looking at air power, and you're looking at psychological and information warfare. Everywhere it seems the Ukrainians have got the better of the Russians.
Finally, sir, I'd like to ask you, this war, and you also raised a lot of questions about modern warfare as per se. You just mentioned about cyber warfare. You mentioned about information warfare being lopsided in terms of its release to the general world. You've spoken about, the lack of air power. So this war is actually making a lot of military analysts, and correct me if I'm wrong, question the basis of modern warfare. How do you see that? And that's something I'd like to conclude with, sir.
Well, everyone does presume that modern warfare means the employment, deployment, and use, exploitation of every technology which is available in the world today. That doesn't always happen, right? It doesn't always happen. And you will find that armies pick and choose. This battle, this particular conflict in Ukraine, I would say, is a combination of the conventional with the hybrid, which is almost bordering on the gray zone war. This combination of ideology, combination of cyber, combination of psychological and information war, these are the ones which now combined and synthesized with the normal means of warfare, which is conventional warfare, all this becomes a synthesis. Now, you don't, armies don't have to necessarily choose every single technology which is available. Some of these technologies are perhaps not available. We have over-assessed that the Russians have got all this capability, but perhaps they just don't have it. Otherwise, by now, the Russians should have been utilizing all this. So, to say that modern warfare, every means will be used is not absolutely necessary. This is something which is a mindset coming out from the Cold War, where we said the best of technologies of NATO and the best of technologies of the Warsaw Pact will come and clash together in the field, and we will see modern warfare in its true form. Right? That never happened. That never happened. Calibrated means of engagements between two sides will continue the way they are. You will find another conventional war somewhere else. For example, somewhere in Africa, there will be something very different.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, it will be something very different. So it will be very regional oriented too, very much south. If you go into the Indo-Pacific tomorrow, in the Taiwan environment, you will find something very different there, which we cannot predict at this time. It will emerge whenever it ever happens, right? So I would say the takeaway should be calibrated employment of different technologies and calibrated employment of strategies, exploiting those capabilities. That is how modern warfare will actually flow out.
I think so. You've clarified a big question that a lot of us would have about India and China. Fully networked army, so as to say, on the other side, and we are who we are today. And of course, the fear is that the Chinese, if ever they do attack India, is going to be a combination of the entire list of technologies that they have. And that is the paradigm on which I think a lot of analysis at the layman's level is taking place with regards warfare between India and China. And I think
we may be all over-assessing a lot about the People's Liberation Army. This war in Ukraine will actually be a bit of a revelation to all of us that every modern technology cannot be exploited in the battlefield. And there are limitations to its use. I think we have a tendency to think that the PLA has soldiers who are 10 feet tall. They too are 5 feet tall.
Yes.
Much shorter soldiers. So I still have a lot of confidence on the Indian warfighting capability, on our own armed forces, on our equipment, on our soldiers, on our spirit, and on our leadership.
No questions on that, sir. I'm questioning the other side's capability, actually. Sir, thank you so much for an eye-opener of an interview, because I think the Ukrainian perspective has not been spoken about much. And this is something I'm sure will evolve as the fog of war dies down, because currently what we are looking at is a lot of information which is coming out. When things do settle down, a lot of people are going to, I'm sure, talk about it, who've been on the battlefield and how they did stuff and so on and so forth. And a lot more analysis would be coming forward. But what all you've mentioned tells us the lessons that one could actually derive out of the Ukrainian effort in terms of resisting the Russians a complete and clear victory, as per se. And I think that's what the Russians wanted to get. Thank you so much for that once again, sir.
Thank you very much, Aadi. And my last word on this would be, such wars don't result. Most people think that there will be a result. Mostly you'll find the result will be no victor, no vanquished.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Jai Hind to all our viewers.
Thank you, sir. Jai Hind. Until next time, sir.
God bless.
Bye-bye.